Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome back to the Islamic SHAHADA channel. In the heart of West Africa lies Niger, a country defined not only by its vast desert landscapes, but also by its remarkably young population. More than half of its citizens are under the age of 15, making Niger one of the youngest nations on the planet by demographic standards. At the same time, more than 95% of Niger's population identifies as Muslim. Islam is deeply woven into daily life, culture, and society. Islam reached the territory of present-day Niger long before the creation of the modern state. Its arrival was not through conquest, but through movement. The steady flow of merchants, scholars, and travelers along the trans-Saharan trade routes. Beginning as early as the 8th and 9th centuries, Muslim traders from North Africa moved southward, carrying salt, textiles, and books, while exchanging gold, livestock, and agricultural products with populations in the Sahel. Along these routes, Islam spread gradually, embedded first among ruling elites and later among wider communities. Several early kingdoms played an essential role in shaping the religious identity of the region. The Kanem-Bornu Empire to the east, already an Islamic polity by the 11th century, influenced communities living in what is now eastern Niger. To the west, the Mali Empire and later the Songhai Empire further strengthened Islamic scholarship and administration in the Sahel. These empires helped normalize Islamic governance, promote literacy in Arabic, and establish connections with centers of learning in Timbuktu, Fez, and Cairo. As Islam took root, Sufi brotherhoods became the primary custodians of religious life. The Tijaniyya order, founded in the late 18th century, became especially influential across Niger's central and western regions. Its networks of teachers, traveling scholars, and local leaders shaped Islamic education through Quranic schools and public gatherings. The Qadiriyya order, older and widespread throughout West Africa, played a similar role, emphasizing spiritual discipline and communal cohesion. For centuries, these Sufi movements defined the religious character of Niger, guiding social norms and mediating community disputes. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, Islam had transitioned from being a religion of elites to the dominant faith across most of Niger's ethnic groups, including the Hausa, Zarma Songhai, Tuareg, Fulani, Kanuri, and others. French colonial rule did not reverse this trend. While the colonial administration attempted to regulate religious authority, it largely left Islamic institutions in place due to their deep influence and organizational stability. As a result, Islam continued its expansion during the colonial period, reaching communities that had previously held predominantly indigenous beliefs. During this long transition, early forms of syncretism were common. Many communities blended Islamic teachings with pre-Islamic traditions such as ancestor veneration, protective rituals, and symbolic practices tied to local cosmologies. Although these elements have weakened over generations, particularly with the rise of formal Islamic education, traces of these historical practices remain in some rural areas. They serve as reminders of the gradual, negotiated process through which Islam became part of Niger's social fabric. The history of Islam in Niger is defined by this layered evolution, a faith introduced through commerce and scholarship, strengthened by empires, shaped by Sufi brotherhoods, and gradually integrated into nearly all aspects of public and private life. Today, Niger stands as one of the most uniformly Muslim nations in the world. According to estimates cited by Open Doors for 2025, approximately 95.7% of the population identifies as Muslim. Other sources, including the U.S. State Department's 2023 Religious Freedom Report, place the figure even higher, noting that more than 98% of Nigerians are Muslim. Despite the different methodologies, all major assessments agree that Islam is overwhelmingly the dominant religion across the country. Most Muslims in Niger follow Sunni Islam, adhering primarily to the Maliki school of jurisprudence, a branch historically rooted in North and West Africa. The Maliki tradition remains influential in community life, shaping daily religious practice, local rulings, and interpretations of Islamic ethics. Alongside mainstream Sunni practice, Sufi brotherhoods continue to play a central role. The Tijaniyya and Qadiriyya orders are the most prominent, maintaining networks of religious leaders, Quranic schools, and community structures that trace back centuries. These Sufi traditions remain especially strong in rural areas, where they act as stabilizing social institutions and guardians of religious continuity. Beyond the majority, Niger also hosts small but notable minority Muslim groups. These include communities associated with Shia Islam, members of the Ahmadiyya movement, and other small Islamic currents. Their exact numbers are difficult to verify due to limited census data and the sensitive nature of religious identification, but all available sources suggest that these minorities represent a very small fraction of the total Muslim population. Relations between religious communities in Niger have historically been calm and cooperative. Christians and Baha'is, the largest non-Muslim minorities, together make up less than 2% of the population. They are concentrated mainly in urban centers such as Niamey and Maradi, where they enjoy relative freedom of worship. Interfaith tensions are minimal compared with many neighboring countries, and Niger is often seen as one of the more religiously tolerant societies in the Sahel. Islamic institutions in Niger continue to play a central role in shaping social life, community relations, and religious understanding. At the heart of this landscape are the ulama, local scholars who interpret Islamic law, lead prayers, and guide everyday practices. Alongside them stand the leaders of the Tijaniyya and Qadiriyya Sufi brotherhoods, whose influence extends far beyond ritual activities. These Sufi leaders often mediate local disputes, organize community events, and provide moral authority in regions where state structures may be limited. Their presence remains a stabilizing factor, especially in rural areas where traditional religious networks are trusted more than government officials. Education is a crucial part of religious life. Madrasa institutions and Quranic schools are widespread, and they remain one of the primary ways children receive basic literacy and religious instruction. However, the system is not without concern. International observers, including analysts cited by the U.S. State Department, have noted that a small number of independent religious schools may expose students to more rigid or politicized interpretations of Islam. While the majority of madrasa programs focus on traditional Maliki jurisprudence and Sufi ethics, the government has expressed worry about the potential for radicalizing influences entering the educational space, particularly from foreign-funded institutions operating outside state oversight. A significant change in recent decades has been the decline of syncretic practices. Historically, many communities blended Islamic teachings with indigenous traditions, including rituals of protection, ancestor-related customs, and seasonal ceremonies. But this mixture has become increasingly uncommon. According to reports referenced by the U.S. State Department, these pre-Islamic elements are far less visible today compared to previous generations. One factor behind this shift is the growing influence of external Islamic movements, supported by religious actors from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf. These networks promote a more standardized, text-based understanding of Islam, often discouraging local customs that do not align with classical jurisprudence. Despite its overwhelmingly Muslim population, Niger maintains a secular state structure. This principle, inherited from the French colonial system, is embedded in the constitution. The government does not enforce religious law, and it regulates religious organizations in an effort to maintain public order and prevent extremist influence. Islamic associations are free to operate, but they must register and comply with national regulations. This model has allowed Niger to balance its religious identity with a legal framework that protects pluralism and freedom of belief, even as the state remains attentive to the rising pressures posed by extremism in the region. Today, Niger is not only defined by its youthful population and deep Islamic identity, but also by a serious and escalating threat from extremist groups. Among the most dangerous are Islamic State's Sahel province, formerly known as ISGS, Greater Sahara, and Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, JNIM, the al-Qaeda affiliate active across the Sahel. These jihadist organizations repeatedly target both military forces and civilians, especially in regions like Tillaberi, Tahua, and Difa. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in March 2025, when 44 civilians were killed during Friday prayers at a mosque in Fambita, in the Tillaberi region. Armed militants allegedly surrounded the mosque, then set fire to nearby houses and a market before fleeing. Another major attack struck in June 2025 in Manda, also in Tillaberi. According to reports, at least 71 civilians died in the assault, which was attributed to ISIS Sahel militants. These attacks reflect a broader trend: jihadist groups consolidating their presence in rural, poorly governed areas, exploiting weak state control and porous borders. Moreover, jihadist violence is not limited to hit-and-run raids. In May 2025, IS Sahel launched a major attack on a military outpost in Eknawan, Tahua region, killing dozens of Nigerian soldiers. These militant organizations have also adapted their tactics. Analysts report increased use of mobility, cross-border networks, and even drone attacks in the Sahel, enabling them to conduct complex operations and sustain a high operational tempo. Beyond physical insecurity, Niger faces a growing challenge of ideological radicalization. While the country has historically been shaped by Sufi traditions, particularly the Tijaniyya and Qadiriyya orders, this landscape is increasingly under pressure from reformist and Salafi movements. According to assessments referenced by Open Doors, these groups encourage a shift away from Sufi practices, criticizing long-established rituals and pushing for a more literal and purist interpretation of Islam. This ideological shift is not uniform across the country, but its influence is rising, especially in urban centers and along major trade corridors. Reformist preachers, often supported by networks outside Niger, use radio programs, online platforms, and community mosques to challenge Sufi authority and promote alternative religious models. Their message resonates particularly among younger Muslims who may feel disconnected from traditional structures or drawn to more assertive forms of religious identity. A critical concern involves madrasa institutions. While most religious schools continue to teach classical Maliki jurisprudence and Quranic studies, a small number have become vulnerable to external ideological influence. Reports from security analysts and regional observers indicate that some madrasas, especially those operating without government oversight, have been used not only for education, but also for ideological recruitment. In these contexts, students may be exposed to teachings that reject local religious customs, delegitimize Sufi leadership, or frame the state itself as incompatible with Islamic governance. This dynamic is particularly dangerous in areas already facing economic hardship and insecurity. In communities where the state is weak and opportunities are limited, ideologues can fill the vacuum by presenting rigid interpretations of Islam as a solution to social frustration or political instability. This environment creates fertile ground for extremist narratives, even if the majority of Nigerian Muslims firmly reject militant movements. Niger's social and political stability is increasingly shaped by the security crisis in the Sahel. Since the 2023 military takeover, the ruling junta government has faced a difficult balancing act, confronting extremist groups that threaten national security while maintaining the country's long-standing reputation for relative religious freedom. Analysts note that the government's approach is complicated by Niger's overwhelmingly Muslim population, its diverse religious institutions, and the risk that heavy-handed policies could alienate communities or fuel ideological resentment. The military authorities emphasize security as their highest priority. According to regional observers, including assessments by African Security Analysis, the junta views the extremist threat as existential, a danger not only to the state, but to the cohesion of Niger's Muslim majority itself. However, this focus on counterterrorism has placed pressure on civil liberties, including the monitoring of religious organizations and increased scrutiny of Islamic schools. The government insists that these measures are necessary, but they have also sparked debate over how far the state should go in regulating religious expression. In this context, the government has introduced new initiatives aimed at mobilizing ordinary citizens. One of the most notable is Garkuwar Kasa, also referred to as the Patriotic Shield program. As reported by international media such as Le Monde, the initiative recruits young men from local communities to support the fight against jihadist groups. These recruits receive basic training and are integrated into local defense structures, effectively turning civilians into auxiliary security actors. Supporters argue that the program empowers communities and strengthens local resistance to extremist infiltration. Critics, however, warn that involving civilians in armed conflict risks escalating violence and deepening communal tensions. Garkuwar Kasa reflects a broader shift in Niger's security landscape. The line between religious identity, community defense, and political authority is becoming increasingly intertwined. As extremist groups exploit ideological divides, economic vulnerability, and weak state presence, the government's reliance on civilian participation underscores the severity of the threat and the difficulty of sustaining long-term stability. The distribution of Islam in Niger reflects the country's geographic and ethnic diversity. In the southern regions, where the population is most concentrated, Islam is deeply rooted in everyday social and cultural life. This area is dominated by major ethnic groups such as the Hausa and Zarma, who have practiced Islam for centuries and developed strong networks of Quranic schools, Sufi circles, and local religious institutions. According to demographic observations compiled by World Population Review, nearly all major urban centers in the south, including Niamey, Maradi, and Zinder, are overwhelmingly Muslim and serve as hubs for both traditional and modern forms of Islamic education. In contrast, the northern regions, which extend deep into the Sahara, are sparsely populated and shaped by nomadic or semi-nomadic communities. Groups such as the Tuareg, Fulani, and Tubu also identify almost entirely as Muslim, but their religious practices often reflect the realities of life in the desert. Here, Islam is more closely tied to clan structures, oral traditions, and mobile patterns of worship. While they share the same Maliki foundation as the rest of the country, these communities may retain distinct cultural expressions of faith, influenced by nomadic customs and regional histories. Religious variation is also visible in the distribution of Islamic movements. Sufi brotherhoods, especially the Tijaniyya and Qadiriyya, remain strongest in rural areas and traditional communities, where long-standing networks of marabouts and religious teachers continue to guide spiritual life. Their influence extends across southern villages and northern caravan routes alike, though their presence is particularly dominant in rural Hausa and Zarma regions. Urban centers, however, show a different dynamic. In cities like Niamey, Tahua, and Agadez, the growth of higher education, international NGOs, and global media has contributed to a rise in reformist Islamic currents, including Salafi-leaning movements. These groups often challenge the authority of Sufi leaders and advocate for stricter interpretations of Islamic text. Their influence is more concentrated in cities, where younger populations have greater exposure to global religious discourse and online preachers. The future of Islam in Niger is shaped by a combination of demographic pressure, religious institutions, security challenges, and international influence. As of 2025, Niger remains one of the most overwhelmingly Muslim countries in the world, with estimates consistently placing the Muslim population at around 99%. Yet beneath this uniformity lies significant diversity in religious practice, generational attitudes, and ideological trends. The next 2 decades will determine whether Niger maintains its historically moderate and community-based form of Islam, or whether social, economic, and political pressures push it toward newer reform movements, tighter religious conservatism, or, in some cases, pockets of radicalization. Niger's demographic profile is the single most important factor shaping this trajectory. With a median age of approximately 15 years, Niger is one of the youngest societies on the planet. More than half of its citizens are under the age of 18. This demographic reality means that the country's religious identity will be defined by individuals who have not yet reached adulthood. Their choices, their influences, and the forms of religious education available to them will determine whether traditional Sufi orders, such as the Tijaniyya and Qadiriyya, remain dominant, whether reformist or Salafi movements gain momentum, or whether hybrid religious identities emerge. The generational divide is already visible. Older Nigerians tend to follow established Sufi networks centered on community cohesion and local leadership, while younger men in urban and semi-urban areas are increasingly exposed to global Islamic discourse through smartphones, social media, and external funding networks. This exposure has begun to reshape religious attitudes, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in stark contrast to long-standing traditions. In this context, the role of religious education becomes critical. For many Nigerian families, especially in rural areas, the first and sometimes only form of formal education is offered through madrasas or Quranic schools. These institutions play a central role not only in teaching fundamental religious texts, but also in shaping moral values, community structures, and expectations for social behavior. However, the system faces pressure to modernize. Since 2023, policymakers and international partners have increasingly advocated for the integration of national curricula into madrasas. They aim to introduce mathematics, basic sciences, digital literacy, and civic education alongside religious studies. The rationale is straightforward. If madrasas continue operating in isolation from the formal education system, the younger generation may emerge religiously literate but economically unprepared. At the same time, religious leaders emphasize that any reform must respect the autonomy of Islamic education and avoid perceptions of external interference. The success or failure of these modernization efforts will play a major role in determining whether Niger's young population develops into a workforce grounded in both religious values and practical skills, or whether gaps in education become a source of vulnerability and manipulation. Security and peace building remain another crucial dimension of Niger's religious future. The country sits at the intersection of several conflict zones, including the Sahel region to the west and Lake Chad to the southeast. Groups linked to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram continue to exploit local grievances, economic marginalization, and weak state presence. Although Niger has shown relative resilience compared to its neighbors, the threat remains persistent. In many cases, extremist groups attempt to justify their operations through religious rhetoric, seeking to appeal to isolated or disillusioned youth. This creates a sharp contrast between traditional Islamic authorities, who emphasize social cohesion, spiritual discipline, and nonviolence, and groups attempting to impose rigid, militant interpretations of religion. Efforts to reconcile these opposing forces are complex but essential. Community-based de-radicalization programs, mediation initiatives led by local imams, and cross-border cooperation with neighboring countries have become foundational components of Niger's security strategy. The degree to which traditional religious leaders can maintain influence over young men vulnerable to recruitment will directly affect the country's long-term stability. Religious leaders also play a substantial role in broader social participation. In many communities, imams and respected Islamic scholars hold more social credibility than political officials or administrative authorities. They are often called upon to mediate disputes between families, negotiate ceasefires between local groups, and facilitate communication between citizens and government representatives. This central role positions them as key actors in conflict prevention and social cohesion. As Niger navigates political transitions, economic crises, and ongoing climate challenges, the authority of religious leaders is likely to remain strong. Their involvement will be essential in shaping public opinion, guiding community behavior, and maintaining open channels of dialogue during periods of uncertainty. Niger's religious landscape is also influenced by international actors. Multiple Muslim-majority countries maintain active religious, educational, and humanitarian programs within Niger. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Algeria, Morocco, and various Islamic organizations, including the Islamic Development Bank and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, provide funding for mosque construction, scholarship programs, imam training, and social welfare initiatives. These partnerships can support development and stability, but they also introduce competing theological orientations. For example, funding from the Gulf states often promotes reformist or Salafi-leaning ideologies, while partnerships with North African institutions tend to reinforce Sufi-based scholarship. Turkish programs frequently emphasize modern Islamic education alongside secular technical training. These influences shape the message received by different communities and can contribute to religious diversification or, in some cases, tension within the country. Taken together, these factors indicate that the future of Islam in Niger will be determined by a combination of internal and external pressures. The dominant trend is likely to be a continued negotiation between traditional Sufi Islam and newer reformist movements, shaped by demographic change and educational reform. The resilience of Niger's social fabric will depend on the ability of religious leaders to maintain cohesion while addressing the needs and concerns of a rapidly growing youth population. The country's security will rely on effective partnerships between communities, government institutions, and cross-border allies to counter extremist narratives, and international involvement will continue to influence theological orientations and institutional development. Niger's trajectory is not predetermined, but the decisions made today by policymakers, religious educators, local leaders, and the youth themselves will define the character of Islam in the country for decades to come. In conclusion, Islam remains overwhelmingly dominant in Niger, shaping nearly every layer of the country's social, cultural, and political identity. With close to the entire population identifying as Muslim, the religious landscape appears unified at first glance, but the reality is more complex. Niger stands at a crossroads, facing a combination of internal and external pressures that will influence the trajectory of its Islamic tradition for generations to come. The rise of extremist groups in the Sahel, the spread of reformist ideologies, the gradual decline of syncretic practices, and the ongoing debate over modernizing religious education are all reshaping the country's religious future in real time. The central question is not whether Islam will remain the dominant faith in Niger, it almost certainly will, but what form that Islam will take. Traditional Sufi networks continue to anchor community life, offering stability and continuity. At the same time, younger Nigerians are encountering new religious interpretations through digital platforms, foreign-funded programs, and cross-border ideological exchanges. How these influences interact, compete, or merge will determine whether Niger maintains its historical patterns of moderation or experiences deeper ideological fragmentation. Ultimately, the future of Islam in Niger depends heavily on its youth. This generation represents the largest demographic group in the country and the one most exposed to economic hardship, political uncertainty, and rapid cultural change. Their choices regarding education, religious identity, and civic participation will define the direction of Niger's Islamic discourse. The ability of religious institutions, community leaders, and the state to guide this generation constructively will be crucial. If they succeed, Niger could strengthen its tradition of communal cohesion and religious moderation. If they fail, the divides between traditional Islam and more radical or rigid movements could become more pronounced. As this documentary draws to a close, viewers are encouraged to pay closer attention to developments in the broader Sahel region, where conflict, displacement, and extremist violence continue to threaten local populations. Understanding Niger's religious dynamics is essential for comprehending the larger regional picture. Viewers can support initiatives that promote interreligious and intra-religious dialogue, advocate for education that balances religious and secular knowledge, or explore the extensive scholarship on Islam in West Africa to gain a deeper understanding of the forces shaping communities in the region. The story of Islam in Niger is still unfolding. How the nation navigates its demographic challenges, security threats, and competing religious influences will determine not only its own stability, but also its role in the future of Islam across the Sahel and West Africa. Thanks for watching until the end. I hope it was useful. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.